Commander Vextor stretched his massive frame across the black stone chair that had been carved from a single asteroid. His razor-sharp claws tapped a slow rhythm against the armrest while his yellow eyes watched the technicians work. The War Council chamber was huge, with walls that curved upward into darkness. Dozens of his officers stood at attention, their scales gleaming under the harsh lights. The Zephyrian Empire had ruled this part of the galaxy for over 10,000 years. They were the ultimate hunters, the top predators that every other species feared. Their ships could tear holes in space itself, and their weapons could crack planets in half. Today was supposed to be just another boring day of watching some backward aliens fight with sticks and stones. "Sir, we got the transmission ready," said Technician Groxol, his web fingers dancing over the control panel. "It's from that little blue planet in the outer rim, the one with all the water." Vextor let out a low rumble that passed for laughter among his kind. "Ah, yes, the humans. I heard they're still crawling around on the surface of their world like insects. This should be amusing." Lieutenant Crixtal stepped forward, his purple scales shimmering with excitement. He was young for a Zephyrian officer, barely 300 years old, and still found joy in watching primitive species destroy themselves. "Commander, our scouts say they fight wars with metal weapons and explosive powders. Imagine being so weak that you need chemicals to make your weapons work." The other officers chuckled and hissed their agreement. They remembered their own species' early days, millions of years ago, when they too had used primitive tools. But that was ancient history now. They had evolved, grown stronger, learned to harness the fundamental forces of the universe. These humans were clearly just another stepping stone on the path to galactic expansion. "Begin playback," Vextor commanded, settling deeper into his chair. The air in the center of the chamber began to shimmer and glow. Slowly, a three-dimensional image formed, flickering at first, then becoming solid and clear. The Zephyrians leaned forward as they saw armored figures on horseback charging across a muddy field, their metal weapons gleaming in the sunlight. "Look at them!" Crixtal snorted, pointing at the humans with one claw. They wrapped themselves in metal like scared little prey animals. And those weapons, just sharpened pieces of iron. We could destroy their entire world with a single thought. The footage showed knights in heavy armor, crashing into each other with tremendous force. Swords rang against shields, arrows flew through the air, and men screamed as they fell. To the Zephyrians, it looked like children playing with toys. Their own weapons could disintegrate matter at the molecular level or create black holes on command. But then something changed. The scenes began to shift and flow, showing different battles from different times. The humans' metal armor became lighter and more flexible. Their swords grew longer and deadlier. Crossbows appeared, then early firearms that belched smoke and flame. "Interesting," murmured Subcommander Nyjera, her scientific mind always curious about evolutionary patterns. They seemed to be improving their tools at an unusual rate. The footage jumped forward in time. Now the humans were using cannons that could knock down castle walls. Their armies moved in tight formations, using tactics that actually made sense from a military standpoint. The Zephyrians watched as human generals coordinated massive battles involving thousands of soldiers. "These aren't random skirmishes," Vextor observed, his amusement starting to fade. "They're organized, strategic." The transmission continued to accelerate through human history. Steam-powered ships appeared on vast oceans, carrying humans to distant lands. Then came railroads that could move entire armies across continents in days rather than months. The humans weren't just fighting. They were building, expanding, connecting their world in ways that seemed impossible for a species so young. "Commander," Technician Groxel said quietly, "the transmission is only 10 minutes long, but it covers thousands of their years. We're seeing their entire military evolution compressed into a single recording." Vextor's secondary eyelids began to flutter, a sign of nervousness that he hadn't experienced in centuries. "How long has this species existed?" "Our xenobiologists estimate roughly 200,000 of their years, sir, but their recorded military history only goes back about 10,000 years. The chamber fell silent except for the soft humming of the holographic projectors. In the space of 10,000 years, barely a moment in galactic terms, These humans had gone from hitting each other with clubs to creating weapons that could level cities. Most species took millions of years to achieve such advancement. On the display, the battles grew larger and more complex. Humans in blue and gray uniforms fought with rifles that could kill from hundreds of yards away. They built fortifications that stretched for miles and used telegraph systems to coordinate attacks across vast distances. "Sir," Lieutenant Crickstow whispered, his earlier mockery completely gone, "how much more of this transmission is left?" Vexthor checked the time display. They had only watched 3 minutes of footage, but already his worldview was shifting. These weren't primitive savages playing at war. These were apex predators in the making, and they were evolving at a terrifying pace. The holographic display suddenly filled with the image of a human officer standing before hundreds of soldiers. Major Harrison wore a simple green uniform, nothing fancy or decorative like the ceremonial armor of Zephyrian commanders. His face was calm, almost boring, as he spoke to his troops about something called Operation Overlord. "Gentlemen, tomorrow we cross the channel," Harrison said in a steady voice. "Many of you won't be coming home, but freedom isn't free, and someone has to pay the price." The Zephyrian officers exchanged confused glances. In their culture, leaders fought from the back, protected by layers of shields and automated defenses. They sent expendable troops forward while keeping themselves safe. But this human was planning to go with his soldiers into certain danger. The scene changed to show thousands of boats crossing a dark ocean. The vessels were packed with humans carrying basic weapons, nothing more advanced than metal tubes that fired small projectiles. From above, it looked like insects swarming across water, but there were so many of them that the ocean itself seemed to be moving. "How many are there?" asked Lieutenant Crickstow, his voice barely above a whisper. Technician Groxall checked his instruments. "Our computers estimate over 150,000 humans in this single operation, sir." Subcommander Inwachura's violet scales had turned pale gray, a sign of deep shock among her species. "They're throwing themselves into certain death," she said, watching as the first boats reached a beach where enemy weapons were already firing. For what purpose? What could possibly be worth such sacrifice? The humans poured out of their boats and ran straight into the killing zone. Many fell immediately, cut down by automatic weapons. But others kept coming, stepping over the bodies of their fallen comrades without hesitation. They didn't retreat. They didn't surrender. They just kept moving forward. The footage shifted to show massive flying machines dropping explosives on cities. Entire blocks of buildings disappeared in clouds of fire and dust. The Zephyrians watched in growing horror as human bombers systematically destroyed their own planet's infrastructure, turning beautiful cities into wastelands of broken stone and twisted metal. "This is madness," breathed Commander Vexthor. "They're destroying their own world's resources. No rational species would waste so much productive capacity." But the worst was yet to come. The display showed trenches stretching for hundreds of miles across muddy landscapes. Humans in different colored uniforms faced each other across a wasteland of barbed wire and shell craters. Then came the green clouds, poison gas that drifted across the battlefield like deadly fog. The Zephyrians watched in stunned silence as humans put crude masks over their faces and continued fighting even as the toxic chemicals burned their lungs. Some fell, clutching their throats and gasping for air. Others stumbled forward blind, their eyes destroyed by the gas, still trying to reach the enemy lines. They continued to advance even while dying, and Whitager observed, her scientific mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The chemical weapons are clearly fatal, yet they maintain offensive operations. A new scene appeared. Captain Williams standing in a concrete bunker, pointing at charts covered with numbers. His uniform was clean and pressed, his voice calm and professional as he discussed statistics that made the Zephyrian officers' blood run cold. Current projections indicate approximately 2 million casualties in the first phase, Williams said matter-of-factly, as if he were discussing the weather. "We'll need to maintain recruitment levels at 400,000 per month to sustain operations." Lieutenant Crickstow's claws scraped against the floor. In Zephyrian warfare, a battle with 1,000 casualties was considered a major engagement. These humans were casually planning operations that would kill more beings than lived on most civilized worlds. "This isn't desperation," Vextor realized, his strategic mind finally grasping the true horror of what they were witnessing. This is systematic, calculated. They've turned mass destruction into a science. The footage continued to show human industrial capacity being converted for war production. Factories that once made consumer goods now churn out weapons by the millions. Women and children worked long hours in these facilities, contributing to a war machine that seemed to have no limits. Then came the moment that changed everything. The display showed a single aircraft flying high above a city. For a moment, nothing seemed different from the previous bombing runs. But when the weapon fell, it wasn't just another explosion. The entire screen filled with blinding white light. When the brightness faded, a massive cloud rose into the sky, shaped like a giant mushroom. The city below had simply vanished, replaced by a crater that glowed with unnatural fire. Commander Vextor's claws punctured completely through his armrest, leaving deep gouges in the ancient stone. The mushroom cloud continued to rise, a monument to humanity's willingness to harness the fundamental forces of matter itself as a weapon. "Analysis complete, sir," Groxo reported, his voice shaking. "The weapon appears to split atoms at the molecular level, releasing energy equivalent to 20,000 tons of conventional explosives." "One weapon," Vextor said slowly. "One weapon with the power of 20,000 bombs." The display showed another mushroom cloud, then another. Intelligence reports flashed across the screen indicating that humans had built hundreds of these weapons, each capable of destroying entire cities. They had literally created the tools of planetary annihilation and were actively manufacturing them by the dozen. "Sir," Lieutenant Crickstow's voice trembled with barely controlled terror, "their weapons can sterilize entire continents. And according to this data, they built enough of them to destroy their own world several times over." The Zephyrian officers stared at the screen in absolute silence, finally understanding that they weren't watching primitive savages play at war. They were witnessing the birth of something far more dangerous than any apex predator the galaxy had ever seen. The holographic display shifted again, and suddenly the Zephyrian officers found themselves looking at something completely different. Gone were the massive explosions and mushroom clouds. Instead, they saw a human in simple camouflage clothing sitting across from another human in a plane room. The setting looked almost peaceful, like a casual conversation between friends. Colonel Davis wore no fancy medals or intimidating armor. He looked ordinary, even boring. But as he spoke, his words carried a weight that made the Zephyrian observers lean forward despite themselves. He was explaining something called counterinsurgency operations to a group of younger soldiers. "The enemy isn't always the one shooting at you," Davis said calmly. "Sometimes the enemy is an idea. Sometimes it's a belief system. And you can't kill an idea with bullets or bombs. You have to understand what people want, what they fear, what they dream about. Then you give them a better story." Lieutenant Crickstow's head tilted in confusion. What kind of warfare is this? Where are the weapons? The armor? The battle formations? The scene changed to show Sergeant Thompson working with a prisoner. But this wasn't the brutal interrogation the Zephyrians expected to see. Thompson sat casually in a chair, offering the captive food and water. He spoke quietly, almost kindly, asking about the prisoner's family, his childhood, his hopes for the future. "I'm not your enemy," Thompson said softly. "I'm just a soldier doing my job, same as you. We both want to go home to our families. Maybe we can help each other make that happen." Within minutes, the prisoner was talking freely, revealing information that would have taken weeks of traditional interrogation to extract. The Zephyrians watched in growing amazement as the human simply talked his way into the enemy's secrets. "How is this possible?" Sub-Commander Enwhitechera whispered, her scientific mind struggling to process what she was seeing. "He's using no force, no threats, no physical coercion. Yet the subject is cooperating completely." The footage shifted to show Lieutenant Roberts sitting in front of multiple screens in what looked like a control room. But instead of weapon systems, the screen showed social media feeds, news broadcasts, and communication networks. Roberts was typing messages, editing videos, and coordinating what he called an information campaign. Target audience analysis complete. Roberts reported to his superior. We've identified the key demographic groups and their primary concerns. Unemployment is at 30%. Food prices have doubled, and the current government has lost credibility among young adults. The Zephyrians watched as Roberts and his team crafted messages that spread across the target nation's communication networks like wildfire. They weren't dropping bombs or sending troops. They were telling stories, sharing videos, and creating narratives that made people question their own government. Within weeks, crowds were gathering in the streets. Within months, the government had collapsed completely. An entire nation had changed hands without a single shot being fired, all because a few humans had figured out how to plant the right ideas in the right minds at the right time. They turned minds against each other. And White HR observed, her combat instincts sending alarm signals throughout her nervous system. The Zephyrians were apex predators through pure physical dominance. Their strength, speed, and advanced technology had kept them at the top of the galactic food chain for millennia. But they had no defense against enemies who fought with ideas instead of weapons. Another clip showed Major Clark standing before a classroom of human officers, explaining something he called narrative warfare. Charts and graphs covered the walls behind him, showing psychological profiles, cultural analysis, and what humans called influence operations. Every society has pressure points, Clark explained. Economic fears, cultural tensions, generational conflicts, religious differences. Find the right pressure point and apply the right kind of influence, and you can make entire populations do whatever you want them to do. The examples that follow were breathtaking in their scope and terrifying in their implications. Humans had convinced democratic societies to vote against their own interests. They had turned allies into enemies and enemies into allies. They had made people believe that lies were truth and truth was lies, all through the careful manipulation of information and emotion. They don't just conquer territory, Commander Vextor realized, his strategic mind finally grasping the full implications of what they were witnessing. They conquer souls. They make their enemies want surrender. The final segment of the transmission showed what humans called Special Forces operations. But these weren't the elite warriors the Zephyrians expected to see. Captain Miller looked like any ordinary human soldier, carrying standard equipment and wearing basic uniform. His mission wasn't to destroy an enemy base or capture strategic territory. Instead, Miller infiltrated a foreign government by simply walking the front door and applying for a job. Over the course of months, he gained the trust of key officials, learned their secrets, and gradually influenced their decisions. When he finally revealed his true identity, the damage was already done. An entire intelligence network had been compromised, not through force or technology, but through simple human interaction. The most disturbing part was how easy it all seemed. These humans had turned deception into an art form and paranoia into a weapon. They could make their enemies doubt their closest allies, question their most basic beliefs, and act against their own best interests. "Sir," Technician Groxo reported, his voice barely steady, "our psychological warfare division wants to know if we should begin developing countermeasures against these tactics." Vextor's laugh was bitter and cold. "Countermeasures? Against an enemy that can turn our own thoughts against us? Against a species that weaponizes trust itself?" The transmission was ending now, but the final message was the most chilling of all. General Anderson, an elderly human with kind eyes and a grandfather's smile, looked directly into the camera as if he were speaking to the Zephyrians themselves. "War isn't about who's strongest," Anderson said in a voice that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. "It's not about who has the biggest weapons or the most advanced technology. War is about who's willing to do whatever it takes to win. And when it comes to survival, humans will do anything. We'll sacrifice everything. We'll become whatever we need to become. Because in the end, the only thing that matters is still being alive when it's all over." The display went dark, leaving the Zephyrian officers sitting in stunned silence. They had witnessed the evolution of a species that had turned warfare itself into something unrecognizable, something that attacked not just the body but the mind and soul. The massive doors of Supreme War Chamber slid open with sound like grinding mountains. Within hours of the transmission ending, every high-ranking officer in the Zephyrian Empire had been summoned to this ancient meeting place carved from the heart of a dead star. The chamber itself was older than most civilizations, its walls bearing the carved victories of 10,000 years of conquest. Admiral Vorthake stood at the center of the circular room, his massive frame casting shadows across the holographic star maps that floated around him like glowing ghosts. For 6 centuries, he had been the supreme military strategist of the Zephyrian Empire. He had planned the conquest of 47 star systems and never lost a single battle. But today, uncertainty radiated from his posture like heat from a dying sun. The other members of the High Command materialized as life-size holograms around the chamber's perimeter. Some were aboard distant warships, patrolling the Empire's borders. Others commanded fortress worlds that guarded strategic hyperspace routes. All of them had dropped everything to attend this emergency session. "Analysis complete," Vorthake announced, his voice carrying none of its usual confidence. "Subject species designated humans possess technology inferior to our own by approximately 10,000 years of development. However, they demonstrate tactical adaptability that exceeds our computational modeling parameters by factors we cannot currently measure." A ripple of unease passed through the assembled commanders. The Zephyrian military machine was built on precise calculations and overwhelming force. They conquered through mathematical certainty, applying exactly the right amount of power to achieve predetermined objectives. The idea that some primitive species could operate outside their models was deeply disturbing. Commander Vextor stepped forward, still bearing the physical signs of his encounter with the human transmission. His claws had carved deep grooves in the stone floor during the viewing, and his secondary eyelids continued to flutter with barely controlled anxiety. "With permission, Admiral, I'd like to upload my direct observations to the Council," Vextor said, his voice steady despite his obvious distress. The neural link activated, and suddenly every member of the High Command experienced Vextor's memories as if they were their own. They felt his initial amusement at the primitive human warriors. They shared his growing unease as the weapons evolved. They experienced his horror at the nuclear weapons and his complete bewilderment at the psychological warfare tactics. When the download finished, the chamber fell into absolute silence. Several commanders' holographic projections flickered as their ship's power systems fluctuated with their emotional distress. "They don't fight like prey species seeking survival," Vextor continued, his words heavy with implications that every military mind in the room immediately grasped. "They fight like apex predators. They fight like us, but without our limitations." Ancient Morgoth materialized at the far end of the chamber, his hologram more solid and detailed than the others. At over 3,000 years old, he was the eldest member of their species still in active service. He had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations, had seen species emerge from primitive worlds only to destroy themselves through war or folly. "Explain these limitations you reference, Commander," Morgoth said in a voice like grinding stone. "What constraints do we possess that this human species lacks?" Vextor's response came without hesitation, as if he had been thinking about nothing else since the transmission ended. "Rationality, Ancient One. We calculate acceptable losses based on strategic objectives. We weigh costs against benefits. We determine the maximum price we're willing to pay for victory and stop when we reach that threshold." The commander paused, his yellow eyes reflecting the glow of the star maps around him. "The humans calculate necessary victories. They decide what they must accomplish, and then they pay whatever price is required. The distinction between acceptable and necessary is the difference between a civilized species and something far more dangerous." Fleet Admiral Rexton's hologram suddenly flared brighter as he accessed the chamber's tactical displays. Three-dimensional maps of local space filled the air around them, showing the positions of every Zephyrian fleet and installation within 100 light-years of Earth. "Based on this analysis," Rexton announced, "I'm issuing immediate withdrawal orders for all assets in Sectors 7 through 12. We establish a buffer zone of no less than 50 light-years between our territory and human space." The other commanders exchanged glances of disbelief. The sectors Rexton was proposing to abandon contained valuable mining worlds, strategic listening posts, and some of the most productive agricultural colonies in their empire. "Admiral," interjected War Captain Zethal, commander of the 3rd Battle Fleet, "you're suggesting we retreat from a species that hasn't even achieved faster-than-light travel?" They're trapped in a single star system with primitive chemical rockets. Rexthon's response was immediate and final. I'm not suggesting retreat, War Captain. I'm ordering survival. Those humans will achieve faster-than-light travel eventually. Every species does, given enough time. When they do, I want maximum distance between them and us. Ancient Morgoth studied the tactical displays with the patience of someone who had seen empires rise and fall like waves on an ocean. You believe they pose an existential threat to our civilization? I believe they pose a threat to the concept of civilization itself, Rexthon replied. Watch their transmission again if you doubt this assessment. They weaponize concepts we never considered could be weapons. They fight wars with ideas, with stories, with the manipulation of reality itself. War Captain Zethal's projection flickered with agitation. But our technology is superior in every measurable category. Our weapons, our ships, our defensive capabilities. Technology can be stolen, reverse-engineered, or independently developed. Vorthike interrupted. But their mindset, their approach to conflict, their willingness to sacrifice anything for victory, that's not technology. That's evolution. They've evolved past a point where normal strategic doctrine applies to them. The debate continued for hours, but a conclusion was inevitable. Every tactical simulation, every strategic analysis, every wargaming scenario reached the same result. In a direct conflict with humanity, the Zephyrian Empire might win the first battle, possibly even the first war. But humans would learn from every defeat, adapt to every strategy, and evolve beyond every countermeasure. The motion is approved, Ancient Morgoth finally declared. All Zephyrian assets will withdraw to the designated buffer zones immediately. We monitor human development from a safe distance and hope they remain contained to their local region of space. As the holograms faded and the chamber emptied, Admiral Vorthike remained alone with his thoughts. For the first time in 6 centuries of military service, he had recommended retreat without firing a single shot. But as he reviewed the human transmission one final time, he knew it was the only rational choice. Somewhere in the darkness of space, on a small blue world orbiting an ordinary yellow star, the most dangerous species in galactic history was taking its first steps toward the stars, and the galaxy's former apex predators were running away as fast as they could. The great assembly hall of the Galactic Trade Consortium had never seen such chaos. Representatives from 47 different species filled a massive chamber, their voices creating a cacophony that echoed off the crystal walls. Some delegates floated in specialized atmospheric bubbles, others stood on mechanical legs, and a few existed as pure energy patterns projected through advanced holographic systems. At the center of it all, Ambassador Velterra of the crystalline hegemony called for order. Her translucent body caught the light from dozens of different suns streaming through the chamber's transparent dome, creating rainbow patterns that danced across the assembled crowd. Fellow beings, she announced, her voice amplified through quantum resonance fields that translated her words into every language simultaneously. We face an unprecedented situation. Within the past 3 standard cycles, entire star systems have been abandoned. Profitable mining operations shut down overnight. Trade routes that have existed for millennia suddenly stand empty. A murmur of concern rippled through the assembly. The Galactic Trade Consortium existed to facilitate commerce between the hundreds of civilized species scattered across this arm of the galaxy. Abandoned star systems meant lost profits, disrupted supply chains, and economic instability that could affect everyone. Trade Minister Quindal of the Tentacle Federation rose from a specialized seating platform, his dozen appendages writhing with nervous energy. His species had built their entire economy on interstellar trade, and any disruption to established routes directly threatened their survival. The abandoned territories, Quindal said, his translator struggling to keep up with his rapid speech patterns. They all belonged to the Zephyrian Empire. The Zephyrians held dominion over this region for 12,000 cycles. Their military might was absolute, their economic power unmatched. Why would they abandon such valuable territory? Representative Thorx of the Silicon-based collective added his mechanical voice to the discussion. Our deep space sensors detected no signs of battle, no evidence of conquest. The Zephyrian fleets simply left They withdrew from strategic positions without any apparent external pressure. The assembly buzzed with speculation and theories. Some suggested internal civil war. Others proposed economic collapse or plague. But none of the explanations made sense. The Zephyrian Empire had been the most stable, most powerful civilization in known space for longer than most species had even existed. Perhaps they encountered something stronger, Quindal suggested quietly, his tentacles curling in on themselves with instinctive fear. The idea that something could be strong enough to make the Zephyrians retreat was almost unthinkable. A heavy silence fell over the chamber as the implications of that statement sank in. If the Zephyrians, apex predators of the galaxy, conquerors of worlds, benders of space itself, had fled from something, what did that mean for everyone else? That's when a figure emerged from the shadows at the back of the chamber. Commander Vextor stepped into the light, and his appearance sent shock waves through the assembled delegates. The former Zephyrian officer looked nothing like the proud warrior aristocrat he had once been. His scales were dull and scarred. His posture spoke of defeat rather than dominance, and his eyes held a haunted quality that made even hardened diplomats look away. "You want to know why we left?" Vextor said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom and bitter experience. "You want to understand what could make the Zephyrian Empire abandon 12,000 cycles of territorial expansion? I'll show you." Without waiting for permission, Vextor activated a portable holographic projector. The same transmission that had changed everything 3 years ago began to play across the chamber's display systems. The assembled representatives watched as primitive humans in metal armor gave way to mechanized armies, then to nuclear warfare, and finally to the psychological manipulation that had broken the Zephyrian High Command. By the time the footage reached the nuclear weapons, several delegates had quietly excused themselves from the chamber. When the psychological warfare segments began, others followed. The implications were too terrifying to contemplate. A species that could turn minds against each other, that could weaponize trust itself, that could make enemies want to surrender. When the transmission ended, those who remained sat in stunned silence. The great assembly hall, usually filled with the sounds of negotiation and debate, was as quiet as a tomb. "The humans aren't coming to conquer us," Vextor explained, his words cutting through the silence like a blade. "They don't even know we exist yet. Their primitive sensors haven't detected our civilizations. Their crude technology can't reach beyond their own star system. But when they do find us, and they will find us eventually, we want to be very, very far away." Ambassador Velterra's crystalline form flickered with confusion and disbelief. "But Commander, they're still confined to their single world. They haven't even achieved faster-than-light travel. How can they possibly threaten established galactic powers with technology thousands of years more advanced than their own?" Vextor's laugh was bitter and hollow, the sound of someone who had seen too much and understood too well. Because apex predators aren't defined by strength, speed, or even intelligence, Ambassador. They're not measured by the power of their weapons or the sophistication of their technology. He gestured toward the now-dark display, where the human transmission had played. Apex predators are defined by their willingness to do whatever it takes to survive and thrive. They're determined by their ability to adapt, to evolve, to become something new when the old ways no longer work. The former commander's voice grew quieter, more introspective. And those humans, they've turned whatever it takes into an art form. They weaponize concepts we never dreamed could be weapons. They fight with ideas, with stories, with the manipulation of reality itself. When they finally reach the stars, they won't just bring superior firepower or advanced technology. They'll bring something far more dangerous. They'll bring change itself. As the assembly slowly dispersed, each representative carried with them the same sobering realization. Somewhere in the outer rim of the galaxy, orbiting an unremarkable yellow star, a new apex species was taking its first tentative steps towards space travel. They were building better rockets, developing more advanced computers, and slowly but inevitably reaching for the stars. The galaxy's established civilizations had always assumed that when humanity finally joined the interstellar community, it would be as another junior partner in the great cosmic hierarchy. But now they understood the truth. When humans arrived among the stars, they wouldn't be joining the existing order. They would be replacing it. And across the galaxy, ancient civilizations began the same desperate calculation that the Zephyrians had made 3 years earlier. How far away was far enough? How much distance would they need to put between themselves and humanity before it was safe? The age of human dominance hadn't even begun yet, but already the galaxy was preparing to bow before its new masters.